like, click, subscribe, do all that. You already know what time it is. It's Netflix time. This movie's called The Power of the Dog. Spoiler alert, let's just get it. So it starts out with this guy named George and his brother Phil. So they've been herding cattle for about 25 years. And they start talking about dead cattle. I guess it's around the time where, they don't figure out about diseases and anthrax or whatnot. So this story is taking place in Montana around 1925. So Phil starts talking about this guy named Bronco Henry. And he pretty much got all his expertise from him. Bronco Henry's a guy he looked up to who passed away like 20 years ago. They were taken over here to this Red Mill restaurant and lounge, and it's run by this lady named Rose and her son who really likes art. His name is Peter. He really wants to become a surgeon. Later on, he goes over by this graveyard and puts up flowers for his father who passed away about 4 years ago. Phil, George, and the boys round up the cattle, head over to the bar, get some shots, and then over to Rose's restaurant. Peter comes over to take the orders, and he had made a bunch of flowers for the table, but Phil starts clowning him like he's some type of pansy or something. Alright, I'll be politically correct today. There you go. They make fun of him as he goes back and gets the food. Rose gets him that food and takes back the flowers in the room, and she starts crying. After everybody leaves, George tries to console her. Everybody else goes to the bar, and after a while, Phil is like, man, where the fuck is George at? He ends up going back to the restaurant, paying off the tab, and then him falling asleep. Next thing you know, George pops up out the blue. George ends up going to sleep with his brother Phil, but you think to yourself, what the heck was he doing the whole time? Later on the next day, he's with the rest of the boys, and he starts looking over this mountain. And he's asking them, what do y'all see over there in the mountain? And Phil's just like, if you can't see it, then it's not there. I feel like it's some type of metaphor, but I'm not exactly sure. Meanwhile, back at the Red Mill, George's been spending a lot more time with Rose. Totally different character than when he was Todd on Breaking Bad, right? He ends up helping out Rose. How exactly? He actually becomes a waiter for her restaurant because for some reason she can't find her son Peter. Meanwhile, Phil's in the house playing his banjo, and George finally comes home. So Phil's like, man, I know what you're doing, but you ain't gotta waste all your time with Rose. You got other important shit to do. For one, he doesn't really trust her, and two, he thinks she's just gonna mooch off of him. I'm like, really? But you can tell at this point, George really likes Rose. So after they cut up some hides later on to make some rope, he ends up writing his letter. I'm not really sure exactly who to. He thinks the girl Rose is suicidal and shit. So clearly he doesn't want George to have anything to do with Rose, or his quote-unquote flamboyant son Peter. So Phil catches up with George later on, and not only has George been seeing her a lot lately, but apparently last Sunday he already married her. So now Phil's like, what in all the fuck are you doing? Apparently she's got some property in this spot called Beach. Phil doesn't take too kindly to this news, and he ends up taking it out on a horse. What the horse do to you, man? Like, come on. Meanwhile, back at Rose and Peter's home, Peter's going to decide to stay for a little bit for schooling, and Rose is coming with George to the establishment. So they're riding off in a stagecoach, but then she wants to stop him on the side of the road for a minute. She gets him out the coach so she can teach him how to dance. And he's never danced before, and you can tell he's very stiff. And he tells her he's happy that he's not alone anymore. I mean, you got Phil and everybody there, but I guess mentally he was not there with the rest of them. So they get back to George's house, she meets up with Phil, and it goes without saying he really doesn't want her there, but what can he do? George gets Rose all settled in, and Phil's trying to sleep, but he has to hear his brother giving Rose the business. So instead he goes into the barnyard and starts working on stuff. We see he has a large memento of stuff that belongs to Bronco Henry. Next day he goes through the woods. I guess he goes to a secret little spot, rubs dirt on himself, and then takes a bath. Why he feels nervous about doing that, I have no idea. So apparently they're about to have a big dinner, and the governor's supposed to be coming to his house, along with his parents. He wants to know if Rose can play the piano for him, but she's been out of practice for a while. Later on, George and his peoples get a piano and carry it into the house. She actually starts playing. She really wants to play this one song, but she keeps messing it up. She gets even more irritated when she hears Phil playing the same song, and he can play it all the way straight through. I don't know if that bothers her, or the fact that it's Phil doing it, or whatever. Then Phil and George get to talking again. He tells him about his parents coming by, the governor coming by, and he wants Phil to be cleaned up before the dinner. And Phil's got that face like, really? I ain't gotta do shit, it's my house. So basically, Phil don't even want to have dinner with him, that be the case. But he thinks those people are bougie anyway. He's like, man, fuck that, I'm a rancher. Later on, he picks up his parents off the train, and everybody shows up. He got the drinks ready. The governor and his wife at attendance. Later on, George goes to the barnyard to get Phil, but Phil's like, man, fuck that shit, I ain't going out there. So after they set themselves a nice meal, they want Rose to play the piano, but she's been either nervous and terribly out of practice, or she doesn't feel like she can play anything. She gets over to the piano, but she can't play shit. Well, at this moment, Phil does decide to show up and starts talking a gang of shit. He eats, everybody leaves, and that's that. Later on, she gets her son Peter and finally brings him to the house. Of course, Phil starts making fun of him again. Later on, Peter goes out to set up a trap, and he ends up catching a rabbit. Rose thinks he's going to keep him as a pet. So George and Phil ended up having like two maids. One of the maids wanted to feed the rabbit a carrot. But when she goes upstairs to give him the carrot, he pretty much used the rabbit to dissect him for a science experiment. I'm like, god damn. More of his research and studying biology and whatnot. Later on, he plays badminton with his mom. After he hits the ball too hard, she's sitting there looking for the ball, and all of a sudden she just breaks down out of the blue. She goes off into this corner of the saloon, and we find out she's been stashing alcohol like everywhere. Phil just happened to spot her after he actually got back to the house. He ends up seeing her as he's looking out the window. And she's doing this throughout the duration of the whole movie as he's holding back whistling. Later on, he goes out to his little quiet place, and he keeps messing with this rag he has. I don't know what the semblance is of it, but that's what he's doing. It might be Bronco's Henry's rag, who the hell knows? Peter's walking by, and he later on stumbles into Phil's hiding spots. He ends up calling into this little mini cave, and he finds a bunch of magazines that was given to Phil by Bronco Henry. What kind of magazines? Let's just say some very quote-unquote flamboyant magazines. Magazines that I'm pretty sure Phil doesn't want out there. Then he wanders through the woods some more. Then he ended up catching Phil swimming naked with like a rag around him. Phil turns around and starts chasing him down the woods. Later on, we see Peter walking with Phil and all the crew. Now all of a sudden, Phil wants to teach him some shit, right? To keep your secret safe for him, right? Rose is thinking to herself, what the fuck is going on? Why is Phil being so friendly to Peter all of a sudden? But you don't know what we know. But he starts teaching them how to tie hide together so they can make rope. Later on, he gets them in the barn and he's going to teach them how to ride horses. But before that, he asks them, what does he see through the mountain? And Peter replies, a barking dog. So Phil's like, how the hell did you figure it out so quickly? Peter's like, I figured it out the moment I saw the mountain. So Rose is tripping all of a sudden that Peter's spending all this time with Phil. She thinks he's got some type of end game or something going on with him. Which I can kind of guess she could be suspicious about, but bottom line is she's been drinking all day. She was fur right then and there talking to Peter. So basically, it's been about 3 weeks now. Peter's learned how to ride a horse to the best of his ability at this point. But Phil wants him to ride on his own so he can get the message. Hey, if you don't figure it out on your own, you'll never learn, right? So he goes back to the house for a minute, picks up some things to put in the bag, and heads on out towards the mountain. So when he gets to a certain spot, he finds this dead cattle that's just sitting there. He puts some gloves on and starts operating on it, but I'm thinking to myself, what is he pulling out this cattle? Mom wakes up the next day out of bed with a hangover and sees that Phil and Peter are going back over to the mountain by themselves. Phil and Peter end up going to this area where it's like a bale of hay, and they set up stilts so they can hold more cattle over there. While they're putting up stilts, they end up chasing a rabbit through a bunch of wood, and they're only able to pull the rabbit out because he ended up breaking his leg. So Phil told him to put it out of his misery. Peter snaps his neck, and I guess Phil didn't see that coming from Peter. So they sit down and talk for a minute, and he talks to him about his father. Peter's father used to be a doctor, but he couldn't find out the symptoms that helped Rose, because Rose wasn't a heavy drinker before he died, but he was. And at a certain point, he ended up hanging himself. And that's how his father passed away. There's going to be a lesson here with all this rope stuff, I promise you. Meanwhile, Rose is looking out the window and she sees some Indians. And they're trying to buy some hide, but they're not letting them and they tell them to go about their business. But then Rose on a drunken tirade tells the Indians to come back. It tells them to take as much hide as they want. But the reason she wants them to do this is because it will clearly piss Phil off. One of the guys gives her a box of gloves and they go back and get the hides. But as she's walking back to the house, she ends up collapsing on the ground. George picks her up and takes care of her, dumps all the bourbon out. Now while he's making sure she gets better, Phil comes back and finds out all his hides are gone. Now all he was really going to do was burn them, but he's pissed off at the fact that anybody took them. Bottom line, they were his. But then Peter tells Phil he has some raw hide stashed away. Phil says he's going to braid it up and finish that rope tonight. Nighttime comes, Phil goes in there to get the rawhide. Peter brings it in through the barnyard, puts his fingers in the water, which was cut by the way, and braiding all that stuff up. And I think Phil cut his hand on moving all that wood earlier by the hay bale. Bottom line, he finished up the rope as they smoked a cigarette together. Now I think it's only a couple days that went past, but George has been checking in on Phil. Apparently something's wrong with him. So George's gonna make Phil go see the doctor, but he's barely been able to move. He's been sweating up a storm. It's like, what the fuck? But he gets himself dressed up in a suit. You've never seen Phil in a suit the entire movie. So we're like, what the fuck? Is this death predetermined or something? Before he leaves, he grabs the rope that he finished with his hand that's still cut, by the way, and they head on out to the hospital. And Phil couldn't find Peter at this point. We're like, where's he at? To which Peter was still in the house the whole time. Next thing we know, we see George picking out caskets. For who? Picking out a casket for Phil? He's done dead as shit? So at this point, they really do host a funeral. We're thinking to ourselves, okay, what the fuck happened? So the doctor comes up to George and said that last couple of weeks he's been having convulsions. And apparently anthrax run through him. Like, what? Basically, he probably touched a diseased animal. But how could that be? Oh, shit. Well, it turns out Peter killed him. So now you're thinking to yourself, how did he do that? Well, it turns out the rope he made, Peter's been touching it the entire time with the gloves. The gloves he used to dissect that cattle the last time he went to the mountain. Seeing how his disease all over the gloves, Phil's hand was completely cut because of the splinters. It pretty much seeped into the cut. So afterwards, Peter basically pushes the rope under the bed, looks out the window, sees the happy couple of George and Rose living happily ever after. My question is, did Rose know about this shit? I'm pretty sure George didn't know. One thing we do know, this is all Peter's doing. The Power of the Dog on Netflix, you already know what time it is. Mr. CCC, ha 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 ha, big, get the goddamn slogan.